Hi, welcome everyone to session 2, workshop number 8, in which we will get to pump up the volume on poetry writing with Molly Feeney Wood, a national consultant whose masterful teaching and students have been featured in the units. Sorry. Let's try that again. Sorry. So Molly Wood is a national consultant whose masterful teaching and student work have been featured in the units of study for teaching reading by Lucy Calkins. And we also have Erik Lepis, co-founder of the Living Literacy Network and former staff developer for a Teachers College Reading and Writing Project. And the two of them will lead us on an inquiry on how to write powerful poetry in the primary grades, and lots of it. Don't forget to include the following hashtag on Twitter to join the conversation. Hashtag the EdCollab Gathering, space, hashtag 8. And you can follow Erik Lepis at Erik Lepis and Molly at Molly F. Wood. All right, take it away.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you. And thank you, Chris, and the whole Educator Collaborative team for inviting us here today. We're so excited to be part of the Day of Learning and Inspiration. And like Diana said, I'm a consultant, I'm a coach, I'm a kind of a part-time activist and a parent. So that's where a lot of my inspiration comes from, is seeing my own children develop. And, you know, kind of to come back to poetry for a second, my daughter is always just doing kind of spoken word poetry at any given moment. So like poetry is something that is part of who we are, and Erik and I are excited to talk about how to teach into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that made me really appreciate this work, especially with young children, was in the classroom as a kindergarten and first grade teacher. I experimented a ton with poetry, especially in the month of April. And I think today's a great example, now that, you know, the sun is out and the birds are chirping, and it gives us sort of more reasons to look at the world with a poet's eye and sort of just like gaze into the beauty and nature that surrounds us, and sort of think about it in new ways and write about it in really inspirational ways. So I think the timing is really appropriate to do this work. And I'm really excited to share what I learned at the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project, and what I built upon in my own classroom, both as a teacher and as a staff developer. So, yeah.
It's exciting. Okay, so let's think about why poetry, right? We kind of spoke a little bit about that just now, but I think that for myself, as I kind of reading a lot more these days, and you know, my children are old enough where I can read again, and have time to read. So one of the things that one of the authors that whose book I've been reading, Mary Carr, she wrote The Art of Memoir. She's a memoirist, but she says in her book that if you want to, that you should really be memorizing poems when you're stuck as a writer in general, because it's poets who teach us about the economy, not wasting a reader's time, right? So nothing's going to teach us about the economy of words better than poems themselves, right? Because in poetry, what we're doing is we're shifting we're kind of changing our definition of volume. In our title of this presentation, we're talking about writing a lot of poetry, which really means writing, a high volume of poetry. But in previous units, and when we've been working with children up until this point, the definition of volume has been like the number of words on a page, the number of lines on a page, the number of pages in a booklet, the number of booklets. And so now our definition of, writing with an eye on, or keeping our eye on volume, it's not about writing as many words as possible. It's about choosing the right words. And that's really what poetry is it's so powerful. What's so powerful about it? It's not about just filling up the page with words. It's really being mindful about the words that we choose, and choosing and making the right choices. So we kind of want you to think about that today, or to kind of think about why poetry, as we, and really, what does poetry mean to you as a teacher and as a person? Because poetry is so personal. I always had a copy of Rudyard Kipling's "If" in my bag, in my wallet, in middle school and high school. It was just a poem that I continue to draw from, even very recently had to kind of go back to that and reread it and find parts that resonated for me, and then remember that I could hold on, I could do this. And, it's one of those poems for me that's been like an anchor. So we want in this, when we think about teaching a poetry writing unit, we want to help kids find those poems that are going to be with them forever, that speak to them now and maybe always. And we want to kind of shift their definition of what poetry, or like what the volume is going to look like in this unit, how it's a little bit different than it has been in the past.
And I think to add on to this idea of volume in poetry, the beauty of poetry is that oftentimes the verses are shorter.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes when you are choosing words carefully, you can say so much in so few words. So then volume then can present itself in the sheer number of poems that kids write. And the beauty of this work is that your writing workshop is really, it's got a buzz, because kids are just writing more poems, and they come running up to you at the, end of the session. I wrote 5 today, and so the beauty in that is that not only are they being so thoughtful, and they're just looking at the world through this, lens of poetry, but they're producing volumes and they're going through the writing process over and over.
Yes, and especially too, we're focused on the K-1, 2 classrooms. So it's not that kids have it's not that they may not have a ton of words at their disposal, right? So now they start to, if that's been something that they've been bothered by, or they've been maybe insecure about, now this is their time to hopefully feel better about themselves and to see themselves as a writer, like we've been encouraging them to see, but maybe they haven't felt that way. So just because they don't have a ton of words at their disposal, they still have the right words. And when kids put words together in a poetic way, it's just so powerful. So it's the quality, not the quantity. So I'm going to attempt my first screen share. So let's see. Okay. I'm going to share our agenda. So we want to think about the conditions that are going to make poetry, or that support our writing of poetry in the classroom. We're going to talk about the process of inquiry, so that students have, that they are immersed in poems and the reading of poetry and looking at poems. And then also, of course, this is a session on writing poetry. We have to talk about how we're going to do that. So the conditions that make this effective would be time, materials, and the writing process. Okay, so I'm going to come back. Let's see, am I back? Okay. So hi. So time is key. And I think sometimes, and I've been thinking more about this recently, where, we're doing a lot. We have our students in front of us, they're on the rug, they're ready to learn, they're ready to listen, and we have them in front of us, and we can often be compelled or feel the pull to demonstrate again, explain again, give another example, reach for another mentor text. And truthfully, we kind of have to get out of their way. We're going to do a ton of work around exploring poetry and poems, but then when it comes time for them to write, not even just in this unit, but in any writing unit, we have to give them time. If we have been so mindful as to carve out a time in our schedule every day for writing workshop, then we have to make sure that with that, sacred time, that we're giving it to the children to actually use, so that they can be writing and we can be working with them, or not, or that they're working independently. But sometimes it can be a challenge to find the time for them to write. And so something that is helpful as an activity and tightening up our teaching is actually just flipping the workshop. So you might try, starting your writing workshops or your writing time with the writing, getting kids just in their spots. They make their paper choices, they do some rehearsal, and then they're writing. And then you are pulling them together midway through or at the end in whatever time you have left to teach them. And that might be 5 minutes. And that's a great activity for us as teachers to figure out, to be effective in this small amount of time. And kind of a silly related example I think of is my purse. If I want to carry less, then I just start carrying a smaller bag and I can fit less into that. And that's kind of what we want to think about with our teaching. If we think that we have 30 minutes for writing workshop, we don't want to take up that whole time teaching. We want to get out of their way and we want them to write. So maybe, try flipping the workshop if that's something that you're kind of studying for yourself as a teacher, to have smaller amounts of teaching and more amount of independent writing time. And the other condition that we want to have in place are the materials, and that the materials in any unit of study should be matching the genre or the form of writing, and that they should really be accessible to the students. So we're going to continue to have paper choices, at their disposal, but we might now have paper choices that, we want to have paper that matches the genre, the kind of writing that we're engaged in, right? So we might have now extra verses, like slips of paper with extra 4 lines in a picture box that they have in the writing center, that we have in the writing center now for our writers, and any kind of material, that we might have, across the day, but just continues to be accessible here, right? So highlighter tape, corrective tape, anything that we want our kids to be using independently and freely. We want to make sure that the writing center at all times matches the kind of writing that they're doing. And then also the other condition that we need to have in place is a student's understanding of the writing process. Erik's going to talk about the writing process in a few minutes, but just really kind of, you want to take some time to think about, what do my students understand about the writing process? And if I were to ask them, what does it mean to draft? What does it mean to revise? What does it mean to rehearse, to get ready to write? I don't, I think sometimes students, they just tell you the definition that we've given them. And so something that Erik and I talk a lot about is like kind of just doing more and more work around process. And so when you look around your writing workshop and you think about your writing workshop, because it's Saturday and you're in your pajamas now, but if you think about your classroom, do you have a lot of students who come up to you and say, I'm done, or I don't know what to do next? Those are signals that they need support understanding the writing process and to understand why they're doing what they're doing, right? So why am I drafting, or why am I doing anything? It's because it's helping me get ready for the next part of the process. And once I have something to revise, or that I have something to, helping them see where they are right now in the process, and that it's helping them move toward the next step of the process. And if they don't know what to do next, or they feel like they're done, then we want to coach into that. So it might be having individual process charts that they're constantly moving themselves around. It might be that the share in every session ends up being, or I should say, like after the mini lesson, sending them off by saying, what's your plan for today? Or where are you in the writing process? Or, what are your plans for your writing today? And then at the end, pulling them back together and saying, so how did you do with that? How did you, checking in on their plan and how successful they were at meeting it, or how did it change? How did their work change throughout the workshop? According to what they thought they were going to be writing that day or doing. So just kind of thinking about checking in with them. What do they understand about the writing process, and where do they see themselves in the process? And it's kind of conditions that we want to have in place. So giving them time, making sure the materials match, and also that they understand what they're doing and why. And we will talk about the writing process specifically in a minute or two. Erik?
So to add on to some of the things that you were saying, time is essential, and giving kids time to write is paramount in making this work happen. So I think that one of the things that makes this work successful is when the teacher decides to let go of all control. Like, poetry isn't an acrostic activity. We don't need to hold their hands. The beauty of poetry writing is that there are no rules. And so if we move away from trying to teach them formulaic kinds of poems, haikus and such, then we let students freely write. And by giving them a little less teaching up front, like you had mentioned, we're really allowing them the freedom to just explore and write and approximate. And with that freedom, I think you see more profound poems. I think that the more we try to teach into, like, it has to go like this, then you're kind of pigeonholing kids. And I think that's what makes poetry scary for adults is because we feel like we're worried and thinking about, does this sound okay? Am I doing it right? And kids have the ability to sort of let go and are sort of free of judgment. So
can I say one more thing about that?
Yeah.
Too? It's just reminding me of what Chris said this morning in the when he was introducing the keynote speakers, which is that a lot of people are making decisions for us and for our students and for our children right now. And that is scary. People, the people who are making those decisions, that can be a scary thing. So we want to give that power back to kids. And that's kind of where I see, we talk about in the title of our session to, make writing powerful poetry. And what's powerful, like you just said, Erik, is giving them the choices, the ownership, the reins, and helping them see that there are no rules, right? And it's just really helping advocate for them by giving them choices,
Yes.
right? So. Okay.
And so also in thinking about these conditions, while we may have materials accessible to students all the time throughout the year in the Writing Center, this is also a great time to bring other materials into your writing workshop. So I would go into my sort of closet where I had my science materials, and out came all the magnifying glasses. Out came all the different kinds of rocks and minerals and gem kinds of things that I had, so that I gave students the opportunity to look closely at different objects that they wanted to write about. So really let sort of poetry infiltrate and take over in the whole classroom, including in, like, the materials. Open the windows, open the shades, open the doors, let kids outside if you can. Go on these little nature walks and things. So when we talk about the writing process in primary, I think one of the things that we want to keep in mind is that kids are consistently going through the process. They're sort of kind of daily churning out numerous poems and going through the process, as opposed to working on a single piece for a longer stretch of time. So of course, we're going to begin with inquiry because that's going to set students up for success. And I'll unpack that a little bit in a moment, but I wanted to spend some time talking about this cyclical process in red that appears right below the inquiry. Rehearse, draft, revise, over and over and over again. And so what we want students to do is essentially go to the Poetry Center, take a sheet of paper, think to themselves, what topic am I going to write about today? And then once they have an idea, they're thinking in this rehearsal, how will my writing, or how will this poem go? Deciding on point of view and form. Then they will draft. They will write the words. If you've included an illustration box, they will draw the picture as well. And then they do some small revision. We want them to reread and think to themselves, should I make a change? We don't have to control those revisions, but just as long as they're looking back at their writing. Now, throughout the teaching, they will learn more techniques for, let's say, all stages of the process, rehearsing, drafting, and revising. And those tools that they might use to revise will become the techniques in which they begin to draft as well. So it's not really so much that it becomes separate, but drafting and revising kind of mesh together or come together at one point where they're drafting and revising simultaneously. So we're thinking of an idea, planning how that poem's going to go, drawing and writing, doing some small revision, go back to the Writing Center, take a new sheet of paper, think, plan, draft, revise. Goes in the folder, go back, think of a new idea, think, plan, draft, revise. So over and over and over again, they're going through this rehearsal, drafting, revising, churning out poem after poem after poem, like little poetry factories, right? And so we want this to go on for weeks in a poetry unit, and having kids cycle through this phase of the process numerous times a day. And then as we're teaching into it, we're gonna, say, as we near the end of the unit, we're going to wrap up soon. And one of the things you want to do is open up your folder and look at all the things that you have and think to yourself, can I select a collection of poems that I might want to create an anthology with? And that when they do select or begin to collect, they might notice, oh, I have a handful of poems that are about pets that I can, you know, put together. Or I have a handful of poems about nature that can go together, or springtime, or seasons, or school poems. And they start to create these little anthologies. Now they move into further revision. They might want to revise some of those poems in that collection. They might want to add additional ones to that collection. So we'll give them another day or two to sort of complete that anthology before they go back to those poems with the lens of editing. And when they look back, they'll, you know, check for word wall words, for punctuation, if they want to use punctuation, because this is one of the cases where you can kind of like play with it in different ways. It's not essential, but they'll, you know, check for capitalization and such, and then they will publish. They will, you know, put that anthology together, and, you know, it's a great time for you to have a poetry cafe. This is one of the units that I love the most in publishing as a primary teacher, because not only was there a celebration like there always is at the end of every unit, but this is the one unit where you can say everyone's going to get a chance to read a poem, because poems are short, that everyone does have an opportunity to share a poem, and it doesn't feel like it takes a very long time to get through everyone. Can
I say something about that too? Which is that poetry is meant to be read aloud. Right, we're not supposed to, it's not like a quiet reading workshop time, or, you know, this is a, you know, we write poetry, we read poetry. It's really meant to be out there and to be shared, you know, verbally. So, or orally. So, I mean, that's it. Like that is such an important part of the process, is having some sort of slam or, you know, share at the end. Sorry.
Yeah, and even having students act out poems together in partnerships and small groups. So, and even I've had, you know, students type up a poem, and it's a great way to like bring technology into it as well. And sometimes too, at the end of a unit, we might add songs to the poetry unit, and having kids record those songs. So in order to make this work possible, so I think what we did was we really, you know, summed up for you how to churn out the volume.
And really not, and to make sure that you are relinquishing control of the choices and the shapes and the handouts. We're stripping it all away.
So are we ready to get to the nitty gritty?
Yeah, I think so.
You want to? All right. So
this is still pretty nitty gritty. This is good. This is the good stuff. Okay, but yeah.
I'm trying to switch back here to my slide. Give me one second. So
do you want to walk us through inquiry?
Yeah, so everything begins with an inquiry. And like other genres, you want to first, you know, spend some time collecting poems that you want to share with the class. You want to collect a variety of poems. There are so many beautiful books of children's poetry out there. The titles are endless. And the great thing about each of those books is that when you purchase one or you borrow one from the library, it's filled with 100 poems. So you can get so much mileage just from one collection. So once you collect poems, in this collection and selection process, you want to consider different kinds of poems. You want to look at some list poems, some free verse poems, some lyrical poems, some narrative poems, because first and foremost, we want students to understand that poetry isn't just sing-songy. It's not Five Little Pumpkins sitting on a fence all the time. Instead, it doesn't have to rhyme. It can sound in a variety of ways. And we want to also select a variety of topics, because a lot of times when we do get our hands on some of these anthologies, they will go together like, these are all poems about school. These are all poems about playing outside. These are all poems about the seasons. So it's important that we select a variety of topics so that kids can see that there are endless opportunities of topics to write about. And then the other thing you're looking for are the different techniques that poets use, and the different, let's say, devices or elements of poetry. So you'll want to find things with rhyme, with alliteration, with consonants, assonance. You want to find ones with rhythm and beat, with vivid imagery. And we'll go more into that as Molly unpacks that later on. So then once you've created your collection and you've collected the poems to use with your class, I would say take a good week to explore poetry. Now, read poetry aloud to your students, create baskets of some of these poems, have students read them together. And as you begin to notice different things, start charting those noticings. It's funny that I'm always like wondering if charting is an actual word, but
it is in our profession. I think you have to. Well, and also, like, as you're doing all the analytical work, like you're saying, that the analytical work might be more important than the actual writing. I mean, it's just as important, right? That like if you spend all that time analyzing and naming and defining the techniques and the sources of inspiration that the poets have drawn from, then you're doing so much more than just composing poetry.
Yeah, and so I think one of the things that I grappled with as a classroom teacher was like, how do I set kids up for this work so that I'm not losing momentum in terms of their writing? Like, I don't want to, let's say, necessarily take off a whole week of writing and let kids just explore. But at the same time, you know, if you don't set yourself up to, let's say, do this read aloud and this inquiry work outside of your writing workshop time as you're wrapping up your previous unit, if you need to take a week to just say, we're using our 30 to 45 minutes of writing workshop time this week to just explore poetry, kids still are writing. They might not have the pen to the page, but they're thinking like writers, they're analyzing like writers, and they're really thinking about the process that writers go through to create these poems. So while the pen might not be to the page for a few days, they're still doing so much thinking work that's going to set them up for the writing that I still consider it writing, even though the pen may not actually be physically moving. So once we notice the different things, the white space, the line breaks, the features of poetry, we want to give names to those things and we want to define them. So when students notice something, and I'll use a simple example like alliteration, we want to name it, we want to give a definition for it, and then we want to find other poems where alliteration exists. And then we want to talk about how it affects the reader. What does it do for the poem? And we teach into that. And so then each of these things that we unlock and we notice, we then teach as the unit begins. So once inquiry has finished and we move into the teaching, we want to first teach students how to generate ideas for poetry. And Georgia Hurd does some amazing work on poetry, and in her book, Awakening the Heart, she talks about these doors to poetry. And so these teachers that I've worked with have created these doors in a variety of ways. These actual icons that you see on this slide were glued into a notebook, and the actual door was cut out so they opened, and behind each door on the lines of the notebook page were the students' ideas. I've also seen teachers actually turn closet doors in their classroom into each of the doors and then list different topics. You could create a chart however you want, but you want to talk about, these are the ways that authors come up with ideas. We can think about our concerns for the world. That is one way that writers come up with ideas. And, you know, April is a nice time to do some of this work with students because Earth Day happens in April as well. So you might be doing a lot of having conversations about the rainforest, about ocean life, about recycling and such. And so tell students that like one way poets can write is we can think about like what, you know, what concerns us in the natural world or the physical world. Then there's your observation door. Your observation door is simply just looking at an object or looking at it with a poet's eye. So having kids peer out the window and say like, what do I see? If I see a tree, that's a possible topic to write about. Even if I look around the classroom, if I see a pair of scissors, that's something I can write about. Then there's your wondering door. This is just the things that you question or wonder about. And so you might have kids just like sort of sit and ponder, what questions, what things like do I have unanswered questions to? Why is the sky blue? Like, how do planes fly? These are all great ways to come up with ideas for poems. Then there's your heart door. Of course, the people, the places, the things that are near and dear to your heart emotionally. There's your memory door, those memories that sort of come back to you over and over and over again, memories that, you know, you wish you could relive, memories that you wish you could forget. And then there's your worry door, which like concerns for the world, things that worry you, but this is going to be more personal. So the first thing we're doing is we're teaching students like these are ways that you come up with ideas. And you can just spend even one day's session introducing all of the doors at one time rather than making your writing workshop seem assignment-like where you're saying, today we're going to write a heart door poem. Tomorrow we're going to write an observation door poem. Instead, day one, say, these are the ways that we can come up with ideas. Let's brainstorm through all of these doors. Then the next part of rehearsal after you generate an idea is planning. In poetry, one thing that I found worked well for me as a teacher was when we come up with a plan, there's two things to consider. One, deciding on the point of view. Will I talk to the topic? So if I'm gonna open up my observation door and I'm going to see a tree, will I talk to the tree, like as if I'm having a conversation with it? Or perhaps I might pretend to be the tree. And so I'll take the point of view that I am the tree and I'm going to describe it from a first person point of view. I might talk about the topic and that might be in the third person, almost like narrating, talking about it. Or might I write a poem so I'm telling it like a story. So the next thing is deciding on what form the poem will take. The easiest form is in the form of a list poem. So it's like you think of your topic and then decide on that point of view and then list the words that go with that topic. You can then also teach children the form of free verse poetry. So just like letting go of control, writing these like these sentences, these phrases that go along with this topic in the point of view in which you selected. Then we have our lyrical poetry where kids are really thinking about rhythm and beat and almost writing those songs with the poems with the song-like quality. And finally, a narrative form of poetry that is telling it almost like a little small story. And that narrative poem could have one voice, or it could have multiple voices. And so you can find some really great poems that have multiple voices, 2, 3, 4 voices, and you see like each column is poem written in different voices. So once kids know how to rehearse, the next thing is getting them to draft and revise with the different elements of poetry. And I'm going to turn that back over to Molly. But, you know, a question did come through in Twitter and like, how do you help manage all of their writing? Because we're talking about churning out all this volume and a simple 2-pocket folder always does the trick, you know? So I'm going to pass this off to you, Molly, if you want to pick up where I left off and,
yes,
and talk about what we're teaching into in terms of elements of poetry.
Yes, and I just want to say too, Eric, what you just said is how kids are getting, I mean, that everything you just mentioned is happening within minutes, and then they're writing. So, you know, all of that work on point of view and then picking the form, that's all happening. Like you're modeling that in your lesson, how that happens quickly. Like you're picking your point of view, you're picking your form, and then you're writing. Those are not, you know, there's nothing drawn out about that. I think that's like a really important point to make for viewers at home. So, okay, so in the very short few minutes that we have left, thinking about, okay, so now that they're writing all this poetry, or we want them to, you know, write with all of these qualities and techniques in mind, we might be, oh, I don't have this pulled up, I'm just speaking. Okay, let me pull this up. That we want to help them revise for the movie, right? We want to help them revise for ways that make their poetry, you know, reveal the movie or the you know, for their readers, in their readers' mind. And so we want to help them create you know, images and use descriptive language to create imagery in their poetry. We want to teach into and name in other poems similes and metaphors, because comparisons are so powerful in helping readers picture something, right? So if you're comparing the unfamiliar, which is what you're writing about in your poem, to something familiar to the reader, it will help them understand, you know, what it is that you're talking about, or what it means to you. Writing concrete poems, you know, in the shape of the topic that you're writing about also reveals the meaning, helps the reader picture what the poem's about. Where you put the text, how big it is, the font, all of those things, you know, they help actually with the music and the movie, help us hear the poem and see it more clearly in our mind. And of course, the use of personification. So when a poet has used personification, it brings the object to life, right? So if Erik's talking about you know, talking as if you are the object, well, you know, give that object some voice. And today's all about voice and advocating for children and giving them voice. And so, you know, of course, that's happening on the granular level of poetry, giving the topics that we're talking about human qualities. So here's a poem that I wrote for copyright purposes. We are using our own homegrown poetry. And so you might hold something like this up for your students. Name some of the techniques, or one or two of the techniques that you'd like them to incorporate. And, you know, discussing with them how the different techniques help create a movie in the mind of their reader. For the sake of time, I'm going to continue on. So we want to think also spend a few sessions of this unit revising for the music, right? All these things that poets do to help create a sound for poetry, which makes reading poetry so much fun and so important. So where the author or where the poet decides to make line breaks changes the way that we read them. The rhythm or the beat that they give their poems helps us find, you know, our job as readers of poetry is to help find the rhythm, find the beat, and then read accordingly. As writers, we want to create, we want to, you know, impact the way that our readers are reading our poetry. So we want to, you know, we want to establish a rhythm. And of course, sometimes poems rhyme. Creating rhyming poetry, and also incorporating assonance, consonance, and alliteration, which is the repeated use of, well, I feel like I'm like speeding through this, but so we want, it's really important too for, you know, think about your kindergartners, your first graders, your second graders, any child who's really developing a letter sound awareness. We want to make sure that we are emphasizing, maybe more for some students than for others, rhyming poems, helping them develop an ear for rhyme. You know, assonance in poems is when there's a repeated vowel sound. Consonance is when there's a repeated use of a consonant sound, you know, at the end of the word. Alliteration is the repeated use of consonants in the begin, or a consonant in the beginning of a word. So all these kind of layers of repetition in poems, repetition of a symbol or a topic, repetition of a word, repetition of a sound, all of these things, you know, maybe sometimes those sounds rhyme. So all of these ways that we're revealing these techniques to our students, you know, will impact, of course, the way that they are, as readers as well of poetry. And so, you know, here's a poem that I wrote again, right? Cold when I'm hot, clear as ice in my cup. I always, always gulp it up. Glug, glug, glug. And so you can use your own poetry, or like Erik mentioned, you know, multiple anthologies to teach off of, and to say, you know, how have I written this in a way that changes the way that you read it? How can we, you know, revise your poem so that it does change the way that you're readers will read your poem as well. So the other thing to actually, I'm going to come back to this for 1 minute too. Inspired greatly by Maggie Roberts and Kate Roberts and their DIY literacy. But wait, am I back? Am I back now? No. Where am I? I'm still here. Just kind of sharing some of the own, like how that might look, right? So like we might want to help kids with, right? So like here's a before, and right, Erik, can you read that?
I love water. It is so good.
Right, so that might be something that they write, and we're like, okay, that's such a great start. You're writing from your heart or something that you really love. So now let's revise it for, let's revise the movie for our reader, or let's revise, the music of the poem. And so you can pick one of those techniques, right? Like let's pick one of those devices that we have taught across the unit and help them see how we can take something that we've started with and we can revise it to add a more musical element or, create a picture in our reader's mind. And so we might pick one of those, like, you might pick like line breaks, very simple way to start, and just say, okay, let's revise, let's add some line breaks in here. I love water. It is so good, right? And so we've written it kind of on like change the line breaks, made it like more of a list poem. And so then, giving them the opportunity after meeting with them or conferring with them to try it themselves, right? And so you can kind of pick something very simple and then walk them through picking a different device or technique, trying it on for size, making something new, and then helping them try. And of course, we want to culminate with an anthology around a topic, like Erik said, or a feeling or concept, or even a form or a point of view. But yeah, that's oof. So this is again, just to wrap up, thinking about this, helping kids write with their own voice. And we can do that by, Erik said, in the beginning, taking away those, templates, having everyone write the same way. No, we want everyone to be in control of the choices that they make. Kindergartners, first grade, second graders, on, their point of view of the poem, their form that they write in, the techniques that they use, and then ultimately what they choose to share with the class. So
let's kind of, leave it with, how do we set students up to do this work? Like if we were to break it down into a step-by-step process of what we want them to go through on a daily basis, would be like step number 1, think of your topic. Step 2, decide on your point of view. Step 3, decide how you want your poem to go. Is it going to be list? Is it going to be lyrical? Is it going to be narrative? And then write it, using all of the techniques to enhance the meaning of your topic through the movie and the music in which you want to evoke for the reader. Revise for some of these techniques that you think could fit into this particular poem. Rinse and repeat over and over again, right?
Right, and then they can take the poems home that they're not choosing to select for their anthology, right? So their folder now changes shape. It ends up being the place where they're housing all their poems that fit their anthology about midway through the unit. So,
so yeah, leaving it
Awesome.
the meaning, the movie, and the music. There you
Yes.
go, poetry.
And the headset, which I've never taken off.
Awesome. Molly and Erik, this has been great. There's so many great takeaways that the audience can just try on Monday, right, with their kids, and the implications beyond K-2. Mm-hmm. I think your audience came away with some great takeaways. So thank you so much. For everyone who's watching, just want to share what's coming up for session 3. Okay, we have workshop number 9, which is Chris Lehman with Amy Riley, Brittany Howell, and Jancy Clark, and they're going to talk about a project that the Ed Collab has created, Global Kind Project. So that, I'm sure, is going to be very inspirational. We also have session 10 with Tanji Reed Marshall, and she will be discussing an invitation to examine, critique, and engage critical media literacy in the age of Common Core standards. And then we also have Ruth Ayers, Moves to Make for enticing hard-to-reach writers. And that is session number 11. We look forward to seeing you and having you tune in to our next session.
Thank
Bye.
you, Diana. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.